So welcome everyone to our last fall gardening session, and it's a little bit different topic tonight. So I'm glad to see all of you here. And I wanted to start out by just telling you a little tiny snippet about our Growing Growers ICT program. As Savannah mentioned, it is a grant-funded program that we carry out through K-State Research and Extension Sedgwick County. And the real focus of that program is to give aspiring fruit and vegetable producers the opportunity to learn basic farming concepts and connect to our grower community so that they can develop profitable farms. And also, we include folks that are looking to develop like nonprofit gardening projects and things like that. So this year, that grant-funded program also has a component where we are seeking to educate both youth and adults in our community about local seasonal produce, when to find it, how to buy it, and help create more opportunities for our local farmers. So a little bit of a plug, if you really appreciate or enjoy the information tonight, we can do this presentation for your women's group, your social club, your men's organization, or for a youth organization as well, like a 4-H club or a Girl Scouts group or a classroom or anything like that. We have different presentations for different audiences. So some more opportunities that could be out there if you've got a group that might be interested. So a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. We are going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say seasonal and local, and a little bit about why we might consider doing that, why we might consider eating at least some part of our food seasonally and or locally. Then we're going to spend a good chunk of time looking at what is in season, what does in season mean, and in South Central Kansas, what is in season and when. And as well as a little bit of fun thinking about ways we could eat all of those great seasonal products, and then how we can shop seasonally and locally. So to kind of kick things off a little bit, I do have a couple of poll questions here. The first one is, and so I'm going to start the poll, and there's 2 questions, so go ahead and answer both of them. You should see that popped up on your screen. So the first one is just asking if you are currently a home vegetable gardener. Yes, no, or not currently, but you have in the past. And then the second question, so just scroll down a little bit, if you don't see that all on your screen, is have you currently, have you shopped for local fruits or vegetables from a farmer's market, farm stand, or you pick farm? And your choices are yes, frequently, yes, on occasion, only a few times, no, or unsure. I'll give you all a minute or two to go ahead and answer those questions. Yep. I'm going to go ahead and pause the poll or stop the poll. And just for fun, we'll look at the results quick. So it looks like most of you either are currently or have been vegetable gardeners. And so, that's a good start. The fact that you've been a gardener or currently are gardening means that you probably already have at least some idea of what to expect from seasonal produce. And then as far as if you've shopped locally, some, kind of all over the place, some frequently, on occasion, only once in a while. So we'll look at some things that you might be interested in doing. Okay. We looked at that. So the first question that I want to answer tonight is to think about what does it mean when we say we want to eat seasonally. And in some regards, I would say this is eating the way that perhaps our grandparents or great-grandparents ate all the time. They ate what was available when in the season that it was produced, and only then, because they didn't have as much access to refrigerated produce that was shipped from all different parts of the globe. And so in a lot of ways, it's like thinking about how things were typically eaten. And so we're focusing especially our fruit and vegetable consumption on items that are naturally ripe at a given time of year. And when we start doing that, it tends to be relatively localized. It often goes hand in hand with buying locally. It doesn't all the time have to. You know, a lot of times, if you've never paid attention in the grocery store, like often there's citrus all year round, right? There's citrus all year round, there's apples all year round, there's strawberries all year round. But if you look at the labels, there's times of year, there's grapes all year round. There's times of year when those products are from the US. You know, so there's times of year when citrus is from the US, there's times of year when grapes are from the US, there's times of year when apples are from the US, but there's other times of year when those same products are not from the US. So the citrus right now, if you look at the labels, most likely are coming from New Zealand or South America, places like that. If you look at apples in the summer, you know, the late spring, early summer, they're probably coming from New Zealand or Australia or South America. Again, kind of the opposite season, right, from when we would normally see them. Same thing with grapes. If you buy grapes in the winter to spring to early summer, they're probably coming from Chile. Whereas if you're buying grapes right now, they're most likely coming from the US. And so you can eat seasonally, but not necessarily locally, just by paying attention to the labels in the grocery store. Often I find, even if I'm not buying locally, if I'm eating seasonally, I'm buying more US products that have been shipped shorter distances. And I'm also buying better quality produce. A lot of times those produce items that have come from the Southern Hemisphere during the off season, they're just not as good a quality simply because of the distance that they've been shipped. And so I like to really focus on eating the things that are in season in the US when they're available. So kind of on the flip side of that, what does it mean when we say buy local? And this seasonal, that's pretty straightforward, right? Like, is it in season or is it not? And where is it in season? Buying local is a little bit trickier term to define. And one of the reasons is that there's really no strict definition when it comes to food. Different people, different organizations like to define local differently. Sometimes they'll say 100 miles, 150 miles, 200 miles. Sometimes you've probably seen this, you know, it's Kansas produced, which is great until you realize that Wichita is actually a heck of a lot closer to Oklahoma than to Kansas City. And so produce grown in Oklahoma is technically more local to us, or parts of Oklahoma is more local to us than things grown in Kansas City or Western Kansas or things like that. So there's no strict definition. And when you start seeing things labeled as local, it's always good to kind of ask the question, like, what definition of local are you using? One of the things I've noticed is that larger retailers and some chain restaurants, they define local in a way that works for them. And usually it's like a multi-state region that is defined as local. And, you know, it's not to say that that's wrong. You just need to be aware that that's what they mean. You know, so a lot of our larger grocery stores in this area, they'll label something as local if it comes from Kansas or a surrounding state, or sometimes even the next tier out of state. So, you know, as long as it's kind of generally Midwest, South, Great Plains-ish, it's often labeled as local. And so, you know, and sometimes there's things that they simply can't get in a more local marketplace to be able to stock them in the grocery store. So when we stop to think about it, eating seasonally and eating locally do tend to go hand in hand quite often, because if you want to shop for local produce, you will typically end up eating seasonally. And if you want to really eat seasonally, you'll probably at some point end up looking for more local produce in order to get some really great options. And so they tend to go hand in hand, although they can be separate at certain times. But why might we do this? You know, what's the reason to do all of these things? You know, and I didn't really put this on our slide, but you know, I think we all, after the last 18 months, are a lot more aware of, you know, what can happen and the potential of disruption in our large scale food chain. And so supporting our local farmers and encouraging more diversity in our local food production system can really benefit our whole society in the long term. So why might we eat seasonally? For me, one of the reasons that I always choose to eat as seasonally as possible is I want the freshest, most peak quality produce. And I really like to enjoy the bounty of each season. And depending on the product and where you're purchasing it, sometimes it's going to be cheaper to eat seasonally. You know, the thing that's really in season might have a better price than the thing that is not in season. I also think eating seasonally is a great way to connect our modern lifestyle with more natural cycles and rhythms of our environment. And you know, we sometimes forget that we are dependent on our natural ecosystem for our life, for our livelihood. You know, all of our needs go back to having food and, you know, a functioning ecosystem. So eating seasonally helps to kind of tune into those things. And then seasonal produce is going to have your peak nutrition, you know, peak quality produce that's harvested at the optimum time and has less transportation is often going to have better quality nutritional content. You know, those grapes that are taking a slow boat or a fast airplane, one way or the other, from South America, by the time they get here and sit on the grocery store shelf, their nutrition just isn't quite as good as it would be otherwise. When we switch over and think about eating locally, there's a lot of economic impacts and other benefits. We are able to support our local farms and our local economy by purchasing those local products. You know, the pandemic has been challenging for our local farmers as well, and supporting them with our food purchases is a great way to help our local economy. You also have the benefit when you start purchasing from a local farmer that you get to know them and their production practices. For some of you, you are probably concerned about, you know, their pesticide applications and their practices and things like that. And this is a great way to find out what they're doing, what they're using, and to support with your purchasing habits, things that you believe are appropriate. The other benefit to eating locally and making those local purchases is it helps you appreciate both the risks and the challenges of production. Now, I know many of you are already gardeners, and so you probably have a little better appreciation for the risks and challenges of food production than others might have. But when you get onto a farm scale, it's a whole nother level of risk and challenge to come up with production. You know, as a home gardener, you know, we can kind of go with the flow a little bit, right? Like, okay, this year I had great tomatoes, next year maybe I don't, no big deal. But when I'm a farmer, that's my income, right? And so appreciating the effort that goes into having that food production. And then overall, both eating seasonally and locally can reduce impacts relating to food transportation, you know, both climate impacts as well as, again, you know, thinking about just all the food chain disruptions that we've experienced over the last couple of years. So those are some reasons that you might consider eating seasonally and locally. So I want to switch over next to talking about a few tips for eating seasonally and how to go about doing that. It's these aren't all the tips, but they're things that, when I think about eating seasonally, that I really try to keep in mind. And so we've kind of mentioned this already, but the first tip is don't assume because you see it in the grocery store that it is in season. And in fact, you want to kind of think a little bit critically about that. It's like, oh, why is this thing in the grocery store this time of year? I wonder what they're doing to make it be here. The reality is that we have really gotten used to having fresh fruits and vegetables shipped to us from Latin America and the Southern Hemisphere, both Central or South America and also, as I mentioned, New Zealand and Australia and things like that. So we've really gotten used to that. And, there's good and bad things about that. But, first off, just be aware, because it's in the grocery store doesn't mean it's in season for us in Kansas. My second tip for seasonal eating is to pretend you're a little bit of a pig with a mud puddle and just simply wallow in the good stuff when it's available. So when something is in season, that means buy it in whatever volume you can afford and eat it until you are tired of it. So for me, when asparagus is in season, sometimes I will buy like 3 or 4 pounds of asparagus at the farmer's market each week that it's in season, and like literally wallow in it. We'll make soup and we'll do roasted asparagus and shave it to put on pizza, and find a way to put it into everything until I'm completely sick and tired of it. And then I'm not nearly as tempted to buy asparagus at the grocery store, at least for a number of months, because I ate so much of it when it was in season and really amazingly good that I'm not tempted to eat it for a while. On maybe a flip side, I don't particularly love zucchini. And so when zucchini is in season, I might buy it once or twice. And for me, that constitutes wallowing in it. Usually by the time I've had it a couple of times, I'm like, okay, I'm good now. And for eggplant, this year I haven't bought it a single time, and I consider that wallowing in it. So, you don't have to eat everything, for sure. But I really, I try to focus on what's really in season, what's exceptional quality, and focus on those things. So tip number 3, and that I'm going to help you with here a little bit later in the presentation, is to really get to know the seasons of where you live. So for us, South Central Kansas, and what to expect when. And that is going to allow you to kind of plan ahead for what you can expect to find. And you're not going to end up putting a kink in your entire meal plan. Sometimes depending on what type of meal planning, or if you do meal plan, that can be a little bit frustrating. Like if you're like, oh, I'm going to go to the farmer's market and buy tomatoes, and you get to the farmer's market and realize like no one has tomatoes yet. And I was planning to do this awesome thing with fresh tomatoes. And now like, oh, I have to come up with another plan on the fly, and that can be frustrating and challenging and so on and so forth. So really kind of getting to know what to expect and when can help you avoid some of those things. And I also find, I kind of go back through my stack of recipes that I've printed out. I was sorting through recipes that hadn't gotten put in our binder, a couple weekends ago, and going through, and it's like, oh, there's like 5 recipes that use raspberries all in a row. That must have been from last year when raspberries were in season, because I had all these raspberries to do something with. Or like, oh, here's a whole stack of recipes using tomatoes and okra. So that must have been, and I can kind of like, okay, I used that last year. Which recipes did I like? And I can look forward to putting them back into the rotation again. So kind of have certain things that you make at different times of year and that you're looking forward to doing those. And my last tip would be that baby steps are okay. I'm not sitting here saying you should stop buying any produce from the grocery store and only buy from local farmers and only eat things that are the most in season, because I think anyone with any sort of health background will tell you that it is more important that you eat some fruits and vegetables, no matter where they come from or in what form they are, than that you eat none. So baby steps are okay, even when we're talking about eating seasonally and locally. And if eating more seasonally and more locally is something that you really want to jump into, you might think in advance, like, what are your compromise items? What are the things that it doesn't matter whether they're in season or not, you're going to buy them. So bananas are never in season in Kansas, because they can't really be grown in Kansas without quite a bit of greenhouse effort. And so, like, maybe you want to eat seasonally and locally, but you're still going to have bananas. Maybe you use spinach in your smoothies every single day, and it doesn't matter if spinach is not in season in Kansas, you're going to buy spinach at the grocery store because that's an important part of your diet. So for me, raspberries are kind of a compromise item. I have a price point that I'm willing to pay, but anytime that raspberries hit that price point or lower, I'm going to buy like 5 or 6 cartons of raspberries because my family eats them like crazy, and that's important to us. So those are some things to think about. So we are going to kind of transition to our next section and look at what's in season and when here in Kansas. And kind of a key as we get going, things that we're going to go month by month, and things that I kind of consider available for really the whole month or the better part of the month, I've just left plain. And then certain items you'll notice either have an asterisk, a little star next to them, and those are things that are just starting to be available and that might be really weather and farmer dependent. So it depends. That means whether you can find them locally in a given month is going to depend both on the weather that year, as well as what particular mix of crops our local farmers have chosen to plant and what sort of season extension activities they are doing in order to make things available earlier or later in the growing season. And then there'll be other things marked with the little caret, a little, upward triangle. And those denote things that are kind of the end of their season availability. So in that month, you may find them, you may not. Again, it's weather and farmer dependent. And so all of these slides and this next section of slides, I think were sent out to you as a PDF in the email that you were sent with the link. If not, you'll certainly get that afterwards. So don't feel like you have to write all the things down because you should be able to get those through the email. These lists are not 100% perfect, and depending on where you shop for your local produce, certain things are not going to be as widely available. I will also note that in some cases, things that technically could be in season, if I know that they're really not available for us locally currently, I tended to drop them off and not include them. So for example, I'm going to keep using raspberries as my example. Raspberries are incredibly difficult to grow on a commercial scale, especially here in Kansas. And so there are times of the year when technically they're in season, but we really don't have any local farmers that are growing them for sale, at least not on any scale of particular note. And so for that reason, I don't really mention raspberries, not because they can't be grown or couldn't be found, but they're just really not very available. So, there's a number of things like that. So just because it's on my slide doesn't mean it's necessarily always going to be super easy to find. So I'm going to start actually in April, and the couple reasons I chose to do that. First, April is when most of our larger farmers markets here in Kansas tend to start. And for a lot of consumers, farmers markets are kind of that first gateway to shopping locally, although there's some other options as well. And April is kind of the point where the weather has warmed up enough to pretty consistently be confident that we are going to have some good produce choices available. April is also kind of an interesting month because we are still kind of in that overwintering phase. And so one of the neat things, I hear this a lot from folks like, oh, there's nothing, nothing can be grown in Kansas except in the summer. Even people who are gardeners, I've heard say that, like, oh, you can only have fresh produce in Kansas for like a few months in the summer. And I grew up in northern Wisconsin. I'm like, y'all have no idea how long your growing season is here. So when you go to a farmer's market or look at a local source of produce in April, there's actually a number of things that could be available because the farmers have been working on overwintering things. So in April, we're pretty firmly in leafy green season. A few of our early spring herbs like chives and cilantro, lots of leafy greens, kale, salad mix, lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, things like that. As well as radishes, salad turnips, not the big purple top turnips, but these little white salad turnips that are a lot more mild, are often available for most of the month of April. And then some things that are kind of just starting to come into season. Asparagus sometimes is ready early in April, sometimes it's a couple weeks into April. And then some of our farmers that are doing greenhouse or hydroponic cucumbers and tomatoes are often starting to have some things available in April, especially towards the later part of the month. And then rhubarb also. Rhubarb is a perennial, it's cool season, so it just depends how fast things warm up in a given spring, whether or not there's going to be a lot of rhubarb available in April. But then also overwintered carrots and leeks. If a farmer were to have planted carrots last fall, April, you're often going to find some good stuff like that if you are lucky and looking out for them. As we move into May, things open up a little bit, and May, there's a lot of change from early May to late May. So we are still firmly in leafy green season. If you go anywhere looking for local produce in May, you should have pretty much your choice of any leafy green you want to find. So lettuces, salad mixes, kale, Swiss chard, arugula, so on and so forth. Asparagus everywhere. And then as we get towards the later part of the month, we're going to start seeing some of the cool season vegetables that take a little bit longer to grow. So things like beets and carrots, you may see baby sizes earlier in the month, and towards the end of May, again, depending on the weather, you may start seeing some larger ones. And interestingly, kind of the same thing with both cucumbers and zucchini. Late May is really early for those crops, but I also know we've got some farmers locally that work really hard to use some season extension techniques so that they can be the first ones to have cucumbers and zucchini at the farmers markets. So if you're really lucky and shop early and regularly, you may find those things towards the end of May. Sometime in the month of May, you'll also start seeing peas, snow peas, sugar snap peas in particular, as well as strawberries. So strawberries are another crop that is incredibly weather dependent. In the 14 years I've lived in Kansas, there have been years when strawberry season starts basically the first week of May. There have also been years when the strawberry season starts about the 3rd to 4th week of May. And usually it lasts 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the number of farmers with strawberries and the types of strawberries they're growing and things like that. So often, sometime in May is strawberry season. Whether it extends into June or is done by June is a little bit dependent on the year. So before we move on to look at our summer months, I want to pause and think a little bit like, okay, when we start talking about leafy greens and root vegetables, sometimes we get in a rut. I know I get in a rut. I'm just like, okay, so I'm going to have salad with ranch dressing and I'm going to like steam or roast my root vegetables and call it a day. It's like, so sometimes we need to get a little bit more creative. So of course our green salads, but thinking about some different toppings, with our radishes, our fennel, asparagus, green onions, things like that. Something that maybe is not very familiar to you is we think of eating radishes raw all the time, right? But you can actually take radishes and saute them in butter and mix some herbs in, some of your spring herbs like tarragon or chives, and they're really good. So if you don't like that kind of spicy zing on radishes, you might consider sauteing them as well. Of course, all the asparagus things, roasted asparagus soup. A lot of the farmers that I follow on social media, in the spring, they have meals where they basically have a crudité platter, right? They have radishes, they have raw turnips, they have baby carrots, and a dip that they've created with herbs from their farm or some hummus or things like that for protein. And then you can also go kind of more the wintry direction with lots of soups, stews, braised greens, things like that. And another option when you're dealing with radishes and some of our other spring veg, carrots and that sort of thing, especially as you get later when you've got some cucumbers, are things like Vietnamese noodle bowls with lots of great vegetables mixed into them. If you haven't visited some of our local Vietnamese restaurants, you'll realize there's a lot of vegetables in there. And you can buy a lot of those vegetables at farmers markets or kind of roll your own noodle bowls. So it's kind of fun to do that. So just some maybe a little bit creative options for using some of your spring produce. As we move into our summer months, so our next month is June. And I will be honest, June is probably my #1 favorite month for produce in Kansas. At the farmer's market, at home, whatever. And the reason is because it is what I consider kind of a transition month. Every month has some sort of transition to it. That's the reality of eating seasonally. But June is like the best of both worlds, especially when you are not just relying on your own efforts as a gardener, but you're also getting things from our local farmers. So usually the first part of June, at least, if you're looking, you can still find some of our leafy greens, some of our spring root vegetables. They're starting to go out of season depending on how early it gets hot. But then sometime in June, we start seeing blueberries and even blackberries come into season. Beets and carrots are fully in season. You can find broccoli, you can find cabbage. Cauliflower is very difficult to grow in Kansas, but if you're going to find it, June's probably when it'll be. And then, June is when tart cherries are in season, and then cucumbers. And some of our bigger things, bigger cool season veg, daikon radishes, fennel, garlic, new crop garlic is harvested usually in June. You're starting to see green beans. You've got snow peas and snap peas all over the place, onions and potatoes. So all the root vegetables, most of the leafy greens, all of the broccoli and cabbage. And then you're also starting to get your summer vegetables with cucumbers and zucchini, and they're really beautiful because of the first things in this of this season. So it's not like right now where there's maybe plenty of cucumbers or zucchini or tomatoes, but they're all a little bit sad looking because it's been a hot summer and things just aren't as pretty. So June is probably, like I said, my #1 favorite month to shop at the farmer's market, to just wallow in all of our local produce. And again, if you're lucky, you should be able to find some cherry tomatoes towards the end of June, maybe some bigger tomatoes from folks that are using high tunnels and things like that. So when we get to the kind of this late spring, early summer range, you've got all of those things that you did in the spring, and then you've added in hopefully strawberries and so many things you can do with peas and beans, and again, those rice bowls with stir fry vegetables, fresh pickled cucumbers, new potatoes with herbs. Just there's not enough meals in June to do justice to all of the different kinds of produce that are available. Sometimes, we've got farmers with beautiful onions that they grew, and a lot of times we think about onions as being like flavoring, right? Like we dice up part of an onion to go into the ground beef or things like that. But those really beautiful onions that come in season in June, you can roast them whole and eat them that way, cut them into quarters and roast them or grill them. You can make onion jam. We made some really great onion jam for a presentation earlier this summer. So lots of things that you can do with those really amazing in-season produce items in June. My font's getting smaller. Can you see it? Every slide, the font gets a little bit smaller, which means there's more and more things. So July is the start of kind of what I would consider high summer. So some of our cool season vegetables, things like beets and broccoli, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, if they didn't finish up in June, they're probably going to be done by the first part of July. So this is, again, one of those points. It depends how fast in the spring and summer it gets really hot and things lose quality and just aren't quite as good. But by July, we've got blackberries and blueberries. We've got usually the middle to the end of the month, we're starting to have cantaloupe and watermelon. And melons are one of those things that can be really tricky because if you go to the grocery store, you start seeing cantaloupe and watermelon usually about Memorial Day. And so you want to assume that you can go to the farmer's market and get those things. In fact, that's kind of the inspiration for the title of the presentation, right? But in reality, these are vegetables that need a lot of heat. And so in most years, we're really going to hit our stride with melons about the third week of July. The first couple of weeks, it's pretty touch and go whether they're going to be available, but about the third week of July is when they really start to kick in. But they're still available now, towards the end of August, beginning of September. So July, we're going to see a lot more green beans. We're going to just start seeing some okra, again, depending on the heat. We've still got a lot of good, potatoes, onions, sorts of things. Rhubarb is just finishing up. But you're also going to see some other kind of fun things starting to show up. Summer apples. So early season apples are going to start showing up in July. And honestly, even some winter squashes, things like spaghetti squash, you could start seeing towards the end of July. And of course, July is the month where the sweet corn and the tomatoes really kick in. And if we're having a good peach year, a year when we didn't have a late freeze, typically our peaches are going to be starting sometime in the month of July as well. So all of the things that we kind of think of as quintessential summer crops really come into play in July for us. Kind of moving into August, so where we've just kind of wrapped up, a lot of the same things as July, although our spring crops have completely dropped off by August. And so we're really focusing on our melons, our peaches, our tomatoes, our eggplants, summer squash, peppers, those sorts of things. If you really look at the list and kind of dig through it, you'll notice there's certain things that kind of stay on. When we get into the summer months, we don't have field-grown lettuce available, but we do have some hydroponic lettuce that is still available if you're looking for that. different herbs kind of come and go throughout the year. Green beans kind of come and go a little bit depending on the year and the month. So all of those different things are typically going to be relatively available in August. And then definitely going to start seeing more winter squash as we get towards the later part of August as well. I guess I was also going to mention like things like kale and Swiss chard those leafy greens are pretty hardy. And so they tend to grow most of the way through the summer. Their flavor can get a little bit stronger as the season goes along. So you kind of want to be aware of that when you're thinking about how you're going to use them. They're maybe not as good for a salad application at this time of year, but you can definitely incorporate them into recipes and stir fries and things like that. The other thing I'll point out that I've included on both July and August is what I've called summer spinach. And what that is there's a couple different species of plants. There's Malabar spinach, there's amaranth, there's New Zealand spinach, there's goosefoot, things like that. There's a number of these different plants that are similar in flavor to spinach, but like hot weather rather than cold weather. But they're definitely not spinach. They're not the same. And in some cases, like they're a little bit of an acquired taste. Like Malabar spinach is definitely kind of a succulent texture. It's very different. New Zealand spinach also is a little more of a succulent texture. And it's not one of those things that tons of producers have available, but there are some that do grow these different kinds of spinach. So if you're a spinach person and you're looking for kind of that summer replacement, you might look for some farmers doing some of those alternative greens during the summer months. So, this is the easy stuff, right? That we all can come up with pretty easily. The high summer produce meals, so melon salads, BLTs, caprese salads, using our basil and tomatoes, roasted okra. I actually made a really yummy Mediterranean tomato and okra stew a couple of weeks ago that I was eating on for lunches for several days. If you're like me and don't love zucchini, you can make zucchini fritters, which are kind of fun to do, and then make an herb tzatziki sauce for a dipping sauce. My family, we really like tomato and corn pie, so mixed with a dressing and baked in the oven. Sometimes with a pie crust, sometimes with a cornbread topping, sometimes just the filling on its own. And of course, peach anything if the weather cooperates. The other thing that is kind of fun, if you either grow yourself or can find some great jalapenos that are relatively good price, making your own jalapeno poppers from local jalapenos is really fun, and it's a nice experience. And it gives you something a little bit different to do. So we will often, when we have lots of jalapenos, we'll cut them in half, and then we'll like kind of do this mix and match thing, right? Where I get like several different kinds of cheeses and fill them with different cheeses, and then wrap them with like some Canadian bacon or regular bacon or beef bacon. One of the vendors at some of the farmers markets, they do this beef bacon stuff that's absolutely amazing. So wrapping it with different things. So kind of the cheese and meats and so on, mix and match. And it's a lot of fun. And is a nice way to do something a little different with some jalapenos. And then eggplant. I'm not a huge eggplant lover. I do not care for eggplant Parmesan at all. But I have found that if I chop it up and I put it into a curry, that I actually enjoy it quite a bit. So, that if there's things that you're just like, oh, I'm tired of this, or I don't know what to do, spread your wings a little bit. There's what I found is usually if there's a vegetable or a fruit that I'm like, I don't really care for that, I can find a way that I do actually like it that doesn't involve breading and frying it. That's kind of my caveat. If I have to bread and fry it, then I'm not sure it's really a vegetable anymore. Although the local farmers will, I'm sure, be happy to sell it to you regardless of how you eat it. So as we move into our fall months, so this is kind of where we're at right now. We are full on in apple season. I ate a really great locally grown apple for dinner just before this presentation. And so those are definitely in season, and we are starting to see our leafy greens come back into play. So we're just starting to get some lettuces back in as the month goes on. Excuse me, we'll start seeing more spinach, but we've still got some of our good summer things as well. So September is kind of another transition month, and it's a month where there's lots of bounty usually with our local farmers, assuming the season hasn't been just absolutely ridiculous with heat and disease and insects, which sometimes it has been. But usually when you start looking for local produce in September, you're going to find tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers everywhere, but then you're also going to start seeing some of those fall root veg and leafy greens coming back into play, as well as some of our really long season things. Again, the apples, the winter squashes, pumpkins, we're going to start seeing more available come September. And then as we move into October, this is the point where it really starts to depend what the season's like again, and where our first frost is going to come into play. Again, we kind of have this mentality like tomatoes are for July and peppers are for July, but in reality, you could be eating peppers and tomatoes and all of those things all the way until frost, if not even a little bit later, depending on what the farmers are doing for their production techniques. So all of those summer things could still be available. Usually melons are not going to still be available by October. They're usually going to end up sometime in early September. But you can often still find cucumbers. Eggplants are going to keep producing until it gets too cold. All of those sorts of things. And then our winter squash are really going to be in full stride, as well as new crop of sweet potatoes, and those sorts of things. And then you'll also see, if you see this really pretty plate here I've got on the screen, kind of the red and the pink and the purple. So that is actually a plate of fall radishes. And when I say fall radishes, I don't just mean they're grown in the fall. These are more daikon types and larger rooted radishes that are usually best grown for us in the fall. And they're not the same size as spring radishes. Like the spring radishes are the little guys that are about a quarter, size. These fall radishes can be 2 to 3 to 4 inches in diameter. And they've got these crazy colors, right? So you can see from this picture, I've got some purple ones that have purple flesh and the pink flesh, which are the watermelon radishes. So just really, really unique colors and really fun to work with. And the other nice thing about them is most of them, that dark red one on top had quite a bit of kick to it, but some of the others, they're actually much more mild than spring radishes, especially the interior part. They're very sweet. And so they're great for pickling, they're great for eating raw, again, that crudité platter, things like that. October, we can also start seeing parsnips. If we've got some farmers growing parsnips in a given year, that's one of those things that I'm like, well, they should be available, but they take a long time to grow. So sometimes you can find them, sometimes you can't. They're definitely not as easy as some of our other crops, for sure. So again, October, great time to be looking for a wide range of local produce options. So some things to think about with our fall produce meals, and some of them may not be, quite as obvious to you. So pumpkin pancakes, stuffed peppers. Peppers are, they really hit their stride in September to early October, and so there's peppers everywhere. from our local farmers in the fall. And so it's a great time to buy a bunch of peppers and do things like stuffed peppers, roast some peppers and put them in the freezer for the winter, things like that. You make spaghetti squash carbonara, all of those great tomatoes that are coming, may not be as pretty as they were in July, but there's lots of them. It's a great time to make some tomato soup. With your leafy greens, start pulling back in like some sausage and kale soup, cooked salads, things like that. And of course, all the root vegetables that you're starting to come back and see in season again. Getting into November, again, this is a point where everyone's like, well, there's nothing in November in Kansas, it's cold. I'm like, it's not always that cold. Sometimes we haven't even had a frost in November. But most of our farmers that are good growers, they're still going to have some apples that are maybe in storage that they've harvested and put in a cooler to keep selling. If there's going to be fall broccoli and cauliflower, sometimes that doesn't hit until November. And you're still going to have lots of root veg, lots of leafy greens. The sweet potatoes, are still going to be available, winter squash and pumpkins, and still likely going to have some greenhouse tomatoes and cucumbers that are kind of picking back up a little bit as we go into the fall. And then kind of, I don't want to say off season, but our less complicated season is kind of December to March. So in this time frame, we can be expecting to find overwintered carrots, turnips, parsnips, and radishes from our local farmers, or as a home gardener, there's things you can do to kind of overwinter some of those crops as well. One of my favorite things that I've done is overwintered purple carrots. And so I actually went with my kids and dug up these purple carrots on Kansas Day on January 29th, and we made purple carrot ice cream in the middle of winter with our own carrots. Definitely some things that can be done. Lots of leafy greens, particularly the really cold tolerant ones like spinach and kale. We've got farmers that are growing microgreens, so the little shoots, as nice ways to get a little more flavor and uniqueness to some of those winter salads and things like that. And then things that could be stored vegetables, sweet potatoes, winter squash, other root vegetables could be stored, kind of in a root cellar or cooler type situation, and sold all the way throughout the winter. As well as hydroponic lettuce is typically available for the majority of the winter as well. Now, I also added this little caveat. Citrus is not something that is local in Kansas because we're not warm enough, but December to March is the time when citrus is as local as it's going to get for those of us in the northern US, because that's the time of year when the citrus grown in California and Texas and Florida is in season and is available. So you're still going to the grocery store for those things, not from a local farmer necessarily, but that's kind of the other local produce item. And I want to mention that because that's the time to gorge yourself on citrus is during those winter months. And so don't feel bad about doing that for sure. So again, our winter produce meals, it can be a little bit of a drag. And this is one of the reasons that it's good to preserve other things that are in larger volumes during the earlier parts of the season. So we've got some things to fall back on because, even I that love vegetables, you can only eat salads or soups and stews with kale so many times before you're like, okay, I'm tired. I'm tired of this. So sweet potato pie, you start looking for things. There's some really interesting winter squash stir fries that involve, some proteins and leafy greens and some spices and things like that that can really change up your flavors a little bit in the winter. I guess this would be a good point to say, were there anything I talked to you about that was a surprise to you or that you're excited about that maybe you haven't seen a lot of and are curious about? Or if there's things that you really enjoy finding locally or recipes that you enjoy. So feel free to drop those in the chat, or if you want to unmute and throw something out there, that would be great. And while you're thinking about that, I did see in the chat box, Marcia was asking about cherries and what about them? So cherries are kind of a challenging fruit for us in Kansas. Tart cherries or pie cherries, if they're available, which we don't have a lot of local growers that grow pie cherries, if they're available, they're usually going to come in season around Memorial Day, give or take a week or so, and be available for the first half to 2/3 of June. But again, it's not super commercially available. And then sweet cherries are one of those fruits that are just not really, they're very, very difficult to grow in Kansas and extremely difficult to grow on a commercial scale, because the flowers tend to get frozen in the spring during a spring frost. And if they set fruit, then they tend to crack badly and so on. So cherries, unfortunately, are one of those things that are just not very viable locally. You know, there's a few varieties that if you want to try them in your own yard, some people have good luck with them. But at least from what I've seen, I haven't seen a lot of commercial growers really trying to do them. So follow-up question about pears. Pears are a little more available. I've actually seen a surprising number of pears this year. Pears typically are going to come in season about August. For us, you know, kind of August into September, depends a little bit on the specific variety that they're growing. Actually, I bought some really beautiful pears at the farmer's market this past weekend. So kind of right about now is pear season. And we've definitely had questions come into the hotline about pears over the last 2 to 3 weeks. So this is kind of pear season. But they're definitely one of those things that is not as widely available as other types of produce. Any other questions or comments? Oh, someone else mentioned they bought the pears too and they were great. I haven't tried them yet. I just know they were beautiful and so I bought them, but they're still sitting on my table. I noticed last night that they were probably about ready to eat, so maybe tomorrow. So months and times of the farmers market at the extension office, which I should mention is not the only farmers market gig in town. So what I would say is the two biggest markets in the Wichita area is the Kansas Grown Market that's here at the extension office and the Old Town Farmers Market, the Old Town Farm and Art Market, which is downtown in Old Town Plaza. They both are going to, most weeks, they're going to have between 40 and 90 vendors. Both markets are large markets. They've got a lot of stuff going on. And both of those markets open in April and go through for sure the end of October. In actuality, the Old Town Market, last year they started this and they're doing it again this year. They are outdoors all the way through the Saturday before Christmas. So they're going all the way through mid-December. And then the market here at the extension office, they go through the end of October. And then they do a monthly indoor market during the winter months. So November through March, typically. And then some of the smaller markets, oh goodness. So there's also a Saturday market in Derby, which is a little bit smaller. There's, I believe it's Thursday afternoon, evening in Keachai. Valley Center has started a smaller farmers market. I'm trying to remember if it's Wednesday or Thursday afternoon to evening. Off the top of my head, I'm not remembering. Some of the smaller outlying communities often will have a smaller Saturday market. There's also Saturday markets in Hutchinson, Newton, and things like that. There was a Wednesday market at Union Station, but they closed early this summer because they didn't have enough consistent vendor and customer traffic. So I know Green Acres and Bradley Fair has a small market on Tuesday afternoons. Lincoln Valley Heights, kind of at Douglas and Hillside, I think, has sometimes had a Wednesday morning market, usually just with one or two vendors, but they're pretty consistent. And then, different, every year is a little bit different. We've also got Common Ground Mobile Market that goes around to a lot of the senior centers and senior living centers and places like that. I think that's most of them as far as markets go. As far as a site that lists them, I will pop that into the chat here. So I maintain a website called ICT Food Circle, and we do have a calendar on there with local markets. I don't always manage to keep it updated quite as well as I might wish, but it'll at least get you started. So you can look for that. Vegetables that do well overwintered. A lot of kale and spinach, which you said aren't good choices for you, do pretty well, depending on what method you're using. I've had pretty good luck with carrots, turnips, fall radishes, parsnips, things like that. And then other things, would be things that you can store for long periods of time. So like a lot of your root vegetables, you can actually harvest and store in there. Like if you have a second refrigerator, I will keep them in the refrigerator for months on end sometimes. So some of those sorts of things. And so actually I'm gonna I have a few more slides that kind of look at some of the methods that farmers use to extend the produce season. Just because, sometimes, when you're more tuned into eating seasonally, you can see something and be like, well, I didn't think that was in season now, or how do they have that? Like they must have bought it from somewhere else and are reselling it. And how does that work? And so there's some things that farmers can do to make produce more available to you for a longer period of time. So the first thing that I kind of want to highlight are hoop houses or high tunnels. And these they look a lot like a greenhouse, right? And in some ways they are similar to a greenhouse, but typically they're not as high tech. They're unheated or minimally heated. They just rely on the sun and to a certain extent wind, natural ventilation. You can see these high tunnels here. This is a farm up in Hutchinson. They have the sides that will drop down so they can ventilate them a little bit better. And you can see the shade cloth over the top to protect from the sun and the heat. And so these hoop houses and high tunnels, typically farmers are using them to enable them to still grow in the soil. They're still growing in their field soil. They're not growing like hydroponically or on a bench or anything like that. It's actually in their soil, but by using the hoop or the high tunnel, they are given protection from our weather extremes that make growing produce really challenging sometimes. So it makes it so that they don't have to deal with periods of heavy rain in the same way that cause disease and cracking on tomatoes. It can protect them from the extreme fluctuations of warm and cold in the winter a little bit. And so that allows them to more successfully grow leafy greens and root vegetables and have them available earlier in the growing season than you might in your home garden, or later in the growing season, or even over the winter. So at this point, I can't think of a whole lot of our farmers that are growing local produce that don't have at least one hoop house or high tunnel in order to really get great quality produce and consistency throughout the season. They're a really important tool for our Kansas farmers. And even on a home gardener scale, it is possible if you've got the space and a little bit of know-how to build your own mini hoop house or high tunnel that you can use in your backyard and get some of those same benefits. Although I'll say, like, the smaller the tunnel is, the less heat bank you've got, so you can't protect quite as much for quite as cold as you can with some of these larger tunnels. This is maybe a little more on a home gardener scale, but our commercial farmers do also use row covers in low tunnels. So the picture here is just from our demonstration garden, so much more a home gardener scale. But these row covers, they're fabric or they can be plastic, sometimes perforated plastic, depending on the specific needs of the situation. Are often put over hoops. And so they're called low tunnels because the hoops are short. You can't actually walk into them, right? But sometimes the row covers will just be laid over the crops themselves, not with the hoop over them. And so the benefit of these row covers is that they give you a few degrees of weather protection. This is maybe 10 years ago now. I had a couple of low tunnels in our demonstration garden, one with fabric, one with plastic, and I had max min thermometers underneath them that I would check every day and kind of keep an eye on. It was really amazing to me, the different temperatures underneath the tunnels versus just out in the garden with no protection, and how much different the produce looks with just those few degrees of protection compared to no protection at all. So even just using a row cover and a low tunnel, depending on the season, sometimes you can still have really great quality lettuce all the way into December. And definitely if you've got root vegetables that you're wanting to overwinter, that's going to help you out quite a bit to do some of those sorts of things. Another thing that our farmers do in order to make sure that they have lots of things available for a longer period of time is staggered planting or succession planting. One of the things, as a home gardener, we tend to approach it, we don't have as much space often, right? But we tend to approach certain crops as we plant them once and then we're done. We plant our tomatoes once and we're done. We plant squash once and we're done. We plant melon once and we're done. We plant lettuce once and we're done. But almost all of these crops can actually be planted a couple of different times, or like in the cases of leafy greens, most farmers will plant leafy greens every week for a month or 2 months in order to have a consistent harvest over a longer period of time. And those are things that you can do on a home garden scale as well, just much smaller. But those are also important techniques. If we expect to have lettuce available at the farmer's market from early April to early June, you can't just plant that once. You have to be planting that on a consistent basis. And so, when you think about what a farmer is doing in order to get that crop to you for sale, it's very complex. Most of the best farmers that are doing all of the succession planting, they have a really detailed spreadsheet with a calendar, and they're planting very specific amounts of things every single week. And then harvesting, on a certain schedule, and just continually planting and harvesting and planting and harvesting. And so whenever you are buying, especially some of these leafy greens, root vegetables, and seeing them, you can know that that farmer has been planting and harvesting those leafy greens every week for weeks in order for you to buy from them every single week. The last thing that I wanted to highlight is that we do have some local farmers that grow vegetables hydroponically in greenhouses. And, sometimes, people like to, I don't know, get into this like, oh, hydroponics are awful, or hydroponics are the best thing ever. They're more environmentally friendly. I don't really like getting into those arguments because I think they both play a role, right? Like there's good things about, regular field production, about high tunnel production and natural soil. There's also good things about the hydroponics because we have to be honest, we have winter here, right? And so we do, there's times of year when if we want to have lettuce available, hydroponic lettuce is our best choice. So if we want to have tomatoes and cucumbers earlier or later in the season, greenhouse grown, hydroponic grown may be the best option that you might have. If my choice is a Kansas grown hydroponic tomato that's available in April or November versus, a tomato that was picked green and gassed and shipped, 1,000 miles from somewhere else, I'm going to go with the Kansas grown hydroponic tomato. So I'm not going to say, we don't want to bash on our local hydroponic and greenhouse producers for sure, because they're an important part of making sure we've got produce available locally. So we started to talk about this in the chat box a little bit already about where can we go to find our local produce. And I do want to, we talked about farmers markets a fair bit. So our biggest markets, typically April to October, Old Town going through mid-December. A lot of our smaller markets are typically open kind of sometime in May to sometime in September. And then you can find different winter markets around. And one of the things to know about some of our farmers markets is, especially the bigger ones, accept debit cards. If you go to their information booth, you can get tokens using your debit card. They also accept SNAP or food stamp benefits. And for folks using their SNAP or food stamp benefits, many of our local larger farmers markets have a program called Double Up Food Bucks, where you actually get a matching amount of money to buy additional produce. And so that's a really great program for our low-income consumers. Also, a number of the vendors, I didn't mention this as well, accept the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program vouchers, which is a program that low-income seniors can use to get vouchers that they can spend on fresh produce at the farmers markets in the summer. So there's some great programs to make local food more accessible to all parts of our community with our farmers markets. Another option that you might consider is what's called a CSA. And a CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. I will go ahead and put that in the chat box as well, since I didn't put it in the slide. And this is a model where you sign up to receive a share of produce. It's a share or a box type program. And depending on the CSA, depending on the farm, usually you're going to get between 3 and 10 different produce items each week for a set number of weeks. We have several CSAs locally, and they're all a little bit different. They break up their seasons different ways. Their shares are, different numbers of items and so on and so forth. So you can kind of look around, see what you can find. Some will let you do half shares or full shares, depending on the number of people in your household and how much produce you think you can eat. So the picture here, this is from Serenity Farm CSA. They're one of our local CSAs. And that picture, they're always, I love their Facebook page because they're really good about sharing each week the picture of what is going to be in their CSA share. So this is a picture from a couple of weeks ago, as far as, so you can see you've got a couple cucumbers, a couple peppers, some hot peppers, some cherry tomatoes, a couple pears, some okra, some different leafy greens, microgreens, herbs, things like that. So kind of a wide range of different things. Typically, the way CSAs work is, and again, each of them are a little bit different, but usually you pay either part or all of the cost up front. And that kind of gets into that community supported piece, because the farmer has all of their expenses up front. And so the CSA allows them to get some of the money up front. And you're essentially entering into kind of a little bit of a contract and a little bit of a risk sharing venture with the farmer, because, you know, okay, so you're paying for a share of their produce each week. And if hail comes and kills all of their tomato plants, then they don't have any more tomatoes for the season, and you don't have any more tomatoes for the season, but hopefully you'll get other produce, you know, instead of that. So each farm that does CSAs does have slightly different structures, and they do the deliveries and pickups a little bit different. And so right now, I know for sure we've got at least 3 to 4 local CSAs, and they're all a little bit different. So, you know, you can kind of look around, see what you can find as far as those go, and see, you know, maybe that might be a good fit for you. You know, if you're not the type of person that really enjoys going to the farmer's market regularly, but you really like produce and want to support a local farmer, a CSA may be a good way to try that out. Locally, we do have some U-pick options. We don't have that many options, and some of them are a little farther away from the Wichita area, but we do have a couple of orchards and berry farms in the local vicinity, as well as some that are a little bit further away, you know, get down to Harper and up to Sterling, and, you know, a little bit further over to Sedan. You know, so within a couple-hour window, driving range, you can find a decent number of U-pick and agritourism type options, which also sometimes includes pumpkin patches and corn mazes and stuff like that. A lot of times U-pick operations are fruit crops, because they can be really labor intensive to harvest. And so the U-pick is a great option for a farmer to not have to pay for all that labor, you know, and so sometimes, not all the time, you may get a little bit of a price break because you're doing the picking rather than paying someone else to pick for you. And depending on the operation, sometimes it's a great way to get larger volumes of produce, as well as just the fun of being out there and having that experience of picking your own fruit and so on. So different U-pick operations sometimes do have other agritourism possibilities, you know, hay rides, you know, they may sell pre-made goods, baked goods, all kinds of different options. So anyway, that's one of those things. So I see in the chat box, you know, really surprised to see locally grown peaches sold this year. All of my peaches frozen February, maybe locally extended out 250 miles. So that's a really good question about the peaches, because yes, most peaches did freeze this year. However, this is where having the right variety and having the right microclimate can really make a difference. You know, because sometimes things are really borderline. So I thought all of my peaches froze in February as well. But I have a peach variety called Contender that is hardy to zone 4. And it went through the cold February spell and then 2 spring freezes, and I still had peaches on it. It wasn't as heavily loaded as some years, but it still had peaches. Most peach varieties did not have a whole lot of anything. But, you know, that's a great example of, you know, sometimes if you've got a farmer that's growing a number of different varieties of things, you know, they may lose a significant part of their crop, but they may still have some things that you might be surprised to find. And, you know, there could also be a farm, you know, 100 miles away that had their own microclimate that might be selling into Wichita too. So both of those things could be the case. I've also noticed, especially kind of through the pandemic, I would say pre-pandemic, Wichita was really focused on farmers markets to the exclusion of almost everything else. And one of the kind of nice side benefits from a local produce standpoint of the pandemic is that some of our other sales methods have really increased and make it a little bit more convenient for those of us that maybe don't have the time or inclination to go to the farmer's market every week. So I've seen more farms start to have farm stands and stores. We've also had a real uptick in farms that are doing online ordering platforms. I can think of at least 4 different farms that offer online ordering with either delivery or pickup options. And some of them are just selling their own things. Some of them sell their own produce plus, some value added things. Others of them are doing a little more like a food hub concept where they are selling their own produce, but then also getting products from other farms that they're also selling through their online platform. So that has been a really nice development that I've enjoyed seeing kind of take off over the last couple of years as well. And then local grocery stores, just wanted to highlight, we do have a lot of diverse grocery stores in Wichita. Our larger and chain grocery stores don't do as much of a job with local produce. They do occasionally purchase from some of our larger farmers that are a little further away. Green Acres here in Wichita often is going to carry some locally grown produce, as well as some of our other smaller grocery stores. Sometimes some of the specialty groceries, things like Thai Bin, I've seen carry some local produce and things like that. So it's a little bit harder to find at grocery stores just because there's a lot more hoops for the farmers to jump through. But there are often some options with our local grocery stores. So I'm happy to take any other questions or encourage you, if you have recommendations for local places that you really enjoy purchasing local produce, feel free to share those in the chat box or with the group. Or not. So I will mention again the ICT Food Circle website. Like I said, it's a struggle for me to keep it updated. It's not as updated as I would like it all the time to be, but it is a good place to kind of go and see some of the options that might be available locally for CSAs and farmers markets and community gardens and all kinds of good stuff like that. The other thing I would recommend, if you haven't already run across the Shop Kansas Farms Facebook page or website, they don't always have the most local for the Wichita area produce, but they do have lots of different farm products on there. And then, just looking for Facebook pages of some of our local farmers markets. Our local farmers markets do a pretty good job of having information about their vendors and things like that that are available in the area, and so you can connect with them as well. So Cindy mentioned that she's toured the hydroponic farm that sells lettuce. I'm assuming here at the extension office that had beautiful lettuce and really clean and tasty. I'm guessing you're probably thinking of Elm Lane Farm. I know also Cheney Lake Tomatoes does grow some really nice hydroponic lettuce as well. So a couple different places that do that. Anyone else have any places, farms that they like to frequent? Or things that they really enjoy getting locally? Okay, well, if not, then I think we are done for tonight.